Hello, welcome back to Ranking Every Doctor Who Story Ever. This is episode 4. As always, remember this is just my opinion, and it's totally okay if you like different stories than me. Alright, let's get right into it. In 255th place, I'm going with Revenge of the Cybermen. Unless you count cameos, this is the only Cyberman story of the 1970s. Considering that, it's a huge disappointment. There are a lot of things that come across as sloppy, such as a scene where one of the characters, Kelman, inexplicably becomes free moments after the crew had him captured. Another questionable moment was when the Doctor seemingly allowed one of the characters to sacrifice himself without a second thought. More significantly, this is one of the weakest portrayals of the Cybermen in the classic era. It largely ignores the most interesting aspects of the Cybermen, emotionlessness and conversion, and instead focuses on one of their worst aspects, their gold allergy. In this story, the Cybermen are straight up destroyed with things called glitter guns. Even the title itself does a poor job of portraying the Cybermen. The Cybermen should not understand the concept of revenge. It does have some redeeming qualities, such as some funny lines, a good pace, and an intense climax. And while I complained about the gold allergy thing being overdone, it's not nearly as bad here as it is in Silver Nemesis. Moving up into 254th place, I have Journey to the Center of the TARDIS. A story set almost entirely inside the TARDIS is such an intriguing idea, but this story was not what I wanted it to be. Firstly, the fact that the Doctor essentially forced 3 random people to put their lives on the line to help Clara was quite disturbing. Also, there are a lot of scenes that consist solely of running around. Meanwhile, the twist that Tricky was told he was an android as a joke was just bizarre. It seemed like they were trying to go for emotional weight, but in execution, it felt like something out of a comedic sci-fi spoof. And finally, the events of the entire story get wiped from all of the characters' minds, so everything that happened ultimately didn't really affect anything. We did get to see a lot of different TARDIS rooms for the first time, so that was cool. In 253rd place, I have Castrovalva. I think a Doctor's first story should focus primarily on introducing that Doctor, but I find that this story does not do a particularly good job of that. The 5th Doctor is straight up incapacitated for a major portion of this story, so it's really difficult to get to know him. I wouldn't have minded it that much if the story was really good, but I actually found it quite dull despite its fast pacing. While the idea of basing a story on the works of M.C. Escher was really intriguing, the budget simply wasn't high enough to execute the concept properly. If you're not familiar with M.C. Escher, he's an artist whose work often involved optical illusions and things of that nature. If the show was able to afford special effects that would make this recursive city look right, I think it would have been a much stronger story. Up into 252nd, we have The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe. Many people seem to dislike the Christmas specials overall, but I actually like them for the most part. Even this one, which I consider to be the weakest of the lot, has several redeeming qualities. I love how Madge and the Doctor meet, and the first 15 minutes or so are quite charming. However, once the characters go into the present box, things take a dull turn. A good portion of this story consists of little more than the characters walking around, but even when the action starts to happen, it's extremely contrived. The trees having a life force sounds like something that belongs in some cheesy environmental movie, not a Doctor Who episode. And the whole men are weak, women are strong thing came off as a pathetic attempt at feminism. I'm all for having a story with feminist themes, but simply calling women strong does not actually address any of the difficulties women face. It almost feels like what would happen if a man who'd never spoken to a woman in his entire life had to write a feminist essay for a class. Even classic stories like The Monster of Peladon are considerably better at handling feminist themes. Despite all of that, the scene where Madge tells her children about their father's death was quite poignant, thanks to brilliant acting by Claire Skinner and Holly Earl. The father ultimately surviving was a bit contrived, but I'll let it slide because it was a Christmas episode. Moving into 251st, I have The Battle of Ranskor av Kolos, or however you say it. Nothing about this story is awful, but as a whole, there's not really anything in it that makes it stand out, or that makes me really want to revisit it. The premise of Tim Shaw making himself into a figure of worship on the planet he was stranded on was interesting, although I think it would have worked better if the society had more than 2 people and had characters that were actually well developed. Graham's struggle with his anger at Tim Shaw was a strong point, although it does result in some underwhelming lines of dialogue and climactic moments like, Don't diss my granddad. There wasn't even a sense of a major threat in this story until the very end. Overall, as I watched this story, I kept expecting it to get really good, but it never did. Into 250th, I have Paradise Towers. While this story is quite fun and entertaining for most of its runtime, it's ultimately very bizarre and pretty stupid. There are a lot of potentially interesting aspects to this story that simply go unexplained. For example, why do the Kangs speak as they do? Why are there two old ladies who are cannibals? Furthermore, the plot in general is nonsensical. If this crazy architect really just wanted to kill everyone in the towers, I'm sure there was a far better method than using clunky robot cleaners to pick people off one by one. And on the other side of things, why did the doctor and his friends design a complex plan to lure the architect to one location when they could have just shot him? They were planning to kill him either way. Stupid as it may be, it's still a very fun story to watch. Up into 249th, I have New Earth. This story does have some good aspects, as it is the first story of the new era set somewhere outside of Earth's orbit, and its premise of creating people to do medical tests on is an interesting one. However, the episode did not use either of those attributes to their potential. For one, the story is set almost entirely inside the hospital, so very little of New Earth was actually showcased. Secondly, the patients who were the result of experiments were not executed properly. Despite supposedly having 1,000 diseases, they could easily walk, and they seem to only have one visible disease. Furthermore, roughly 10 different types of medicine seem to cure them entirely. Shouldn't they still have 990 diseases? It doesn't even make sense that existing medicines would fully heal those people. If they're part of ongoing experiments, shouldn't they have diseases for which there is not yet a cure? Cassandra is also sort of a weird addition to this story, and her constant transference between people's bodies has a cartoonish vibe. Although, strangely enough, I found her final scene to be quite poignant. In 248th, perhaps controversially, I'm going with The Daemons. There are a lot of stories that I personally dislike, but I still completely understand why other people like them. For example, I could definitely see why people like The Power of Three, or Dark Water, or Fugitive of the Judoon, but I really don't see why this story is loved as much as it is. Don't get me wrong, as usual, this list is just my opinion, and I'm not judging you at all if you do like this story. I'm simply saying that I don't understand why it's so popular. Sure, it's well acted and has a good atmosphere, but that can be said for a ton of stories. When it comes to the specifics of this story, I really don't like it. First of all, the whole master allies with an alien race that he ultimately cannot control trope really started to feel played out, as it was an aspect of pretty much every Season 8 story. The plot is heavily padded and slow-moving. It would more or less work as a full story even if episodes 2 through 4 were straight up removed. Meanwhile, I really don't like when stories get too big for their britches, and the claim that these daemons were responsible for all of humanity's scientific advancements is a prime example of what I'm talking about. If the daemons were instead part of a New Era-style story arc where they showed up in several episodes leading up to a climactic finale, I wouldn't have minded. But the daemons were on screen for a very limited amount of time, yet the script tries to make them one of the most important creatures in the show's history. Lastly, contrived is not a strong enough word to describe this story's resolution. Jo eliminates the daemon because she says that she's willing to sacrifice herself to save the Doctor. Why in hell would a super intelligent being, supposedly responsible for much of Earth's progress, be destroyed by words? Cybermen don't have emotions, but they don't explode when somebody else says something emotional in their presence. All that being said, I do absolutely love the moment at the end when Yates asks the Brig to dance. Up into 247th, I'm going with The Invasion of Time. There are actually a ton of things that I like about this story, such as the Doctor's mysterious behavior throughout the first half of the story, the Sontarn reveal at the end of episode 4, and the fact that the final episode is set almost entirely inside the TARDIS. However, for everything I liked about this story, there were 2 or 3 things that I didn't like. Firstly, it exacerbates the problems of the Deadly Assassin. Specifically, it portrays what is supposed to be one of the most advanced species in the galaxy as a bunch of inept bureaucrats. Meanwhile, the Vardens are one of the most forgettable villains in the history of the show, despite being the main antagonist of the first 2/3 of the story. And the last episode, despite the appeal of the Sontarns and the setting, is mostly just running around until the Doctor is able to acquire the superweapon. Leela's departure is also extremely lame, perhaps the worst since Vicky's. Why do so many of my favorite companions get terrible goodbyes? In 246th place, I have The Celestial Toymaker. This story suffers from being wiped more than most missing stories because seeing movement is often necessary for understanding what's going on, as opposed to other stories where dialogue is mostly sufficient. Meanwhile, the Doctor is hardly even in this story, which doesn't help matters. It seems like it would be a bit of silly fun if we could watch it in video format, but I seriously doubt this story is going to be animated soon, as it has one, let's just say, unfortunate line of dialogue. Up into 245th, it's another story with missing episodes, The Space Pirates. This story is not as bad as people say. It has several things to like: a reasonably interesting plot, some funny lines and moments, multiple interesting characters, and a tense climax. That being said, I do have several issues with this serial. Despite the fact that I liked Milo as a character, his accent is almost unbearable. Meanwhile, there are several plot twists which are either executed poorly or just plain stupid. The reveal that Madeline was working with Cavan could have been interesting, but on screen she was basically against him from the start, so it barely felt like they were ever working together. And the twist that Dom was actually alive was both ridiculous and unnecessary. Other problems include Cavan, who is a very forgettable villain, and the fact that the Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe are basically side characters for most of the story. However, if this story does get animated, I think people will discover it's a pretty entertaining romp. Moving up into 244th, it's the second Season 8 story I'm going to talk about in this episode, The Claws of Axos. Quite similarly to Arachnids in the UK, this story seems to take a stance against a political position, despite the fact that the particular position is actually a good thing within the context of the plot. In this story, the Doctor directly denounces nationalism, but later notes that it is a good thing in the current context. This just seemed like an odd choice to me. Why try taking a stand against nationalism in a story where it's a good thing? I don't mind politics in Doctor Who, but I do mind when they're not executed well, and this is a prime example. Perhaps the worst thing about this story, though, is the special effects. Most of the costumes look like leftovers from an Italian restaurant-themed haunted house. On the other hand, the best part of this story is the interaction between the Doctor and the Master. Even though they wouldn't like to admit it, they are similar to each other in many ways, and their scenes together in this story reflect that. Moving to 243rd, I have Terminus. From space lepers to the center of the universe to the Black Guardian's mission to kill the Doctor, this story is loaded with intriguing ideas. However, the various plot elements combined create an overly cluttered story that does not seem to know quite what it wants to do. The story is also campy at times, particularly in scenes with Olvir, who is played by a less than stellar actor. However, several of the story's ideas are nonetheless interesting, even if it doesn't use them particularly well. Finally, Nyssa is great throughout her entire final story, and her goodbye scene is beautifully acted by all those involved. Up to 242nd, I have The Seeds of Death. I think I might have liked this story a lot more if it took place earlier in Troughton's tenure. It reuses several aspects of past Troughton stories, such as weather control, menacing spheres, deadly foam, and a negative attitude towards technological progress, which all felt played out by the time this serial rolled around. Also, I found the story to be quite uneven. The first episode is extremely drawn out and very little happens, while the second is rushed to a ridiculous degree. The TARDIS crew somehow needs only 2 minutes to convince a bunch of strangers that they are the best people to pilot a rocket to the moon. And the Ice Warriors themselves are sorely disappointing in this story. They're essentially just fat Cybermen. This story does have several saving graces, though. It's well acted, the plot more or less makes sense, and it emphasizes the mental strain that the ordeal had on several of the crew members in the moon base, which is something that tends to be overlooked in most stories. And finally, moving into stories that I give a 5 out of 10, in 241st place, I have Image of the Fendahl. There are a lot of good things about this story. The atmosphere, for starters, as well as some of the ideas, such as the exploration of human origins. However, there are also some aspects that are really lacking. The story contains a lot of technobabble by the Doctor that isn't elaborated on, and the Fendahline's design is quite poor, especially for something that was equated with death. In short, this is the story that I think of whenever I need an example of a random nondescript Doctor Who story. It isn't awful, it isn't great, it just exists. Thanks so much for watching episode 4, hope you enjoyed. I actually produced episode 5 concurrently with this episode, so if it's not up already, it should be up shortly. See you next time.